There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the Turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He'd duck and cover. Duck and Cover. So goes the title tune of the infamous Cold War instructional film Duck and Cover, released by the United States Federal Civil Defense Administration in January of 1952. In the film, the cartoon character Bert the Turtle, along with narrator Robert Middleton, explain how best to survive and avoid injury in the event of a nuclear attack. Duck and Cover. Happen to be out in the open when the bomb drops? Well, no problem. Just dive into a ditch behind a fence or wall or lie flat on the ground, making sure, of course, to cover your neck and head as before. It's that simple. In the present day, Duck and Cover and similar Cold War instructional films have become widely mocked, emblematic of America's dangerously naive and optimistic attitude during the atomic age. Indeed, today the entire premise of the film seems patently absurd. After all, a school desk cannot possibly offer any protection against a nuclear weapon. But is that mocking actually valid? After all, scientists then, as now, are pretty incredibly smart, and they are the ones that came up with this recommendation. This all now brings us to the question of the hour: how effective was ducking and covering, and just what is the best way to survive a nuclear blast? Well, grab your survival rations, Geiger counter, and squeeze yourself into your refrigerator, and let's find out, shall we? Just before we get into all of that, our crack team here has been researching, writing, and making videos like these somehow for almost 2 decades now. Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, and you're watching Today I Found Out. And as you might guess, a ton of work goes into all of it, and we have used a lot of different tools over the years as well, from organizational services to video and imaging editing software to also tools that help us not have to create every single visual from scratch. This is all where today's sponsor, Storyblocks, comes in, used by creators the world over, including ourselves. In a nutshell, Storyblocks is an all-in-one creative toolkit. Stock footage, music, sound effects, templates, everything in one place, and insanely importantly, it's all real human-made content. On top of that, everything you download is also royalty-free and pre-cleared, which means no stress about copyright issues later. So instead of digging through random sites or bouncing between different tools trying to find one usable clip, you can actually find something that fits. You can pull what you need: background footage, music, small visual details, whatever, and keep the editing and production moving forward. It just makes the whole process faster and lets you focus more on explaining the idea. Storyblocks is just one of those tools that quietly does a lot of heavy lifting in the background and has long been essential to our work here as well. So to start telling better stories, head to storyblocks.com/TIFO. Right now, they're offering 15% off an annual plan for a limited time, and that discount is only available through my link in the description. To begin with, in order to know how to protect yourself in a nuclear blast, we need to look at what actually happens in one, as well as dispel some common misconceptions about the effects of nuclear weapons. Most of us likely picture a nuclear explosion as being like that terrifying dream sequence in Terminator 2: Judgment Day, a gigantic, all-engulfing fireball that instantaneously vaporizes an entire city and all the people within it, leaving behind only smoldering ash and charred skeletons. But while such apocalyptic destruction is typical of modern thermonuclear weapons or hydrogen bombs with yields in the millions of tons of TNT, early pure fission nuclear weapons of the kind available in the late 1940s and early 1950s when Duck and Cover was produced were considerably less powerful. Indeed, the Little Boy bomb dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 had an explosive yield of only 15 kilotons of TNT, while the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later had a yield of 21 kilotons. Looking deeper into the effects, Little Boy detonated around 600 meters or 2,000 feet above the city, producing a fireball reaching temperatures in excess of 7,000 degrees Celsius or 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This immense heat instantly vaporized people standing near the detonation point, infamously leaving only ghostly black outlines or shadows in their place. However, the fireball only lasted a few seconds and grew to a maximum diameter of only 400 meters or 1,200 feet, meaning these effects were limited to an area of only around 0.125 square kilometers or 0.05 square miles, approximately the size of 20 or so football fields. Furthermore, while this area was subjected to an overpressure of 5 pounds per square inch or 35 kilopascals, most of the structures directly beneath the blast remained relatively intact. This included the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, known today as the Atomic Bomb Dome and preserved as a permanent memorial to the victims of the bombing. Beyond this zone, however, the main shockwave reflecting off the ground combined with the air blast via what is known as the Mach-Stem effect to produce winds of up to 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles per hour that swept people off their feet like leaves, turned window glass and other building materials into lethal projectiles, and collapsed even reinforced concrete buildings out to a radius of 1.8 kilometers or 1.1 miles. At the same time, the bomb emitted two powerful blasts of infrared radiation known as thermal pulses. The first occurred right at the moment of detonation and lasted only a millisecond before the optically opaque case shock, the hot, ionized remains of the bomb casing and other components, overtook and occluded the fireball. Soon, however, the case shock cooled and became more transparent, allowing the second thermal pulse to emerge. This pulse lasted a full 3 seconds, depositing enough thermal energy to inflict third-degree burns on exposed skin out to a radius of 1.4 kilometers or 0.88 miles, and milder burns resembling severe sunburn out to 2.2 kilometers or 1.4 miles. It also touched off fires throughout the largely wooded city, which quickly merged into a raging firestorm, a terrifying, self-sustaining flame tornado that sucks in air from all directions and can generate wind velocities of up to 200 kilometers or 120 miles per hour. This was by far the most destructive and deadly effect of the atomic bomb, destroying more buildings and killing more people than the initial fireball, blast wave, and thermal pulse combined. Similar firestorms had previously been ignited in other cities using conventional incendiary bombs, including Hamburg in July of 1943, Dresden in February of 1945, and Tokyo in March of 1945. Indeed, the firebombing of Tokyo, codename Operation Meeting House, was the deadliest single raid in the history of aerial warfare, destroying 41 square kilometers or 16 square miles of the city and killing around 100,000 civilians in a single night. This made it what is generally cited as the most humans killed by other humans in a single day in the history of the world. And noteworthy in this, not a military fighting another, but a military slaughtering about 100,000 civilian men, women, and children, reasoning that at least some of the civilian buildings they were destroying were being used to manufacture things for the war effort. Which was technically true. General Curtis LeMay, who helped oversee this and several similar bombing raids, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which all combined are estimated to have killed over 500,000 Japanese civilians and left about 10 times that amount homeless, noted of this most deadly night in the history of humanity. The US had finally stopped swatting the flies and gone after the manure pile. And that, killing Japanese didn't bother me very much. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Fortunately, we were on the winning side. Every soldier thinks something of the moral aspects of what he is doing, but all war is immoral, and if you let that bother you, you're not a good soldier. These were shockingly similar sentiments to those used by the Japanese military leaders in their slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians that the US government at the time had correctly vilified them for. But we were the good guys, so it was fine in our case. One-time Secretary of Defense and previous officer under LeMay, Robert McNamara, would wrestle with this distinction in the Fog of War documentary, stating, LeMay said if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. LeMay recognized that what he was doing would be thought immoral if his side had lost. But what makes it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win? Do check out our over 2-hour documentary, Swept Under the Rug, The Japanese Holocaust, diving into so many of the atrocities committed by both sides in the Pacific Theater. It's unfortunately age-restricted because of what it covers, but I think one of the best videos we've ever produced. But going back to Little Boy and the best ways to survive nuclear blasts, by the time the fires were put out, 12 square kilometers, or 4.7 square miles of Hiroshima had been destroyed, around 64,500 people killed, and around 72,000 injured. Thousands more, however, would later succumb to the insidious effects of radiation poisoning and radiation-induced illnesses like cancer, brought upon by prompt neutron and gamma radiation from the blast itself, or the radioactive fallout, which fell back to Earth in the form of black rain. By the end of 1945, the total death toll from all causes was estimated at 140,000. Meanwhile, the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9th had a higher explosive yield of 21 kilotons. However, the blast was largely contained by the hillsides of the narrow Urakami Valley. The bomb was also dropped some 3 kilometers or 1.9 miles from the planned aiming point, detonating over the city's more industrialized northern region. As a result, no firestorm broke out as in Hiroshima, and the bomb's overall effects was less severe, destroying only 7.7 square kilometers or 3 square miles of the city, killing 39,214 residents and injuring 25,153 officially. More than 30,000 more would die of injuries and radiation poisoning by the end of the year, for a total immediate death count of 70,000. While rapid advancements in post-war technology resulted in lighter, more compact nuclear warheads, the average yield of these weapons did not dramatically increase. This was due to the inherent limitations of conventional nuclear weapon design. The higher a weapon's yield, the more fissionable material, uranium or plutonium, is required. However, only a tiny fraction of this material actually undergoes fission and is converted into energy, the rest being vaporized and scattered without contributing to the yield. Indeed, of the 64 kilograms of uranium-235 used in Little Boy, only around 0.001%, or 1 gram, was converted into energy. Yes, you heard that right, a sliver of metal the weight of a paperclip. And while weapons designers have come up with various means of making warheads more efficient, including the use of tampers, levitated pits, and other techniques far beyond the scope of this video, practical efficiency of pure fission weapons still tops out at only around 2 to 3%. This makes high-yield weapons in the megaton range impractically heavy and bulky, as well as wasteful of expensive nuclear material. Indeed, the largest pure fission weapon ever tested, Ivy King, detonated in the South Pacific on November 16, 1952, had a yield of only around 500 kilotons. As a result of such limitations, for the first decade or so of the Cold War, most operational nuclear weapons had yields and effects similar to their Second World War forebearers, and this in turn meant that the inescapably lethal effects of nuclear detonation, flesh vaporizing temperatures, and prompt neutron radiation would only be experienced by those caught within a relatively small radius from the hypocenter, which was around a kilometer or so depending on the yield. Those outside this zone, however, would face far more survivable hazards, namely the thermal pulse, the blast wave, flying debris, collapsing buildings, and fires. As these effects are nearly identical to those of conventional high explosive and incendiary weapons, early Cold War civil defense tactics were adapted directly from those developed during the Second World War, with target cities maintaining specially trained forces of air raid wardens, firefighters, militia, and other civil defense personnel who would rush into bombed-out cities in the wake of a nuclear attack to douse the flames and rescue citizens trapped in the rubble. Indeed, until the insidious long-term effects of prompt radiation and radioactive fallout were better understood, in military circles, nuclear weapons were treated very much like conventional munitions, only much, much bigger. Thus, while those caught within the immediate blast radius of an atomic bomb were almost certainly doomed, whether they had a refrigerator or not, those standing farther away stood a relatively decent chance of surviving the initial effects, if they immediately took the proper precautions. With that understanding out of the way, this now brings us at last to the main subject of this video, the widely mocked survival strategy of ducking and covering, and what is the actual best way to protect yourself in a nuclear blast. First off, contrary to popular belief, this duck and cover maneuver was never intended to protect against the atomic fireball itself. Rather, it was meant to provide those farther away from the hypocenter with useful measures of protection against the bomb's other effects. For example, even ordinary window glass can block out most thermal and ultraviolet radiation, meaning that merely being inside a building or car can provide significant protection against the thermal pulse. And while you might at this point be thinking about the shattered glass not blocking anything, well, that comes later. And even if you are unlucky enough to be caught in the open when the bomb goes off, facing downwards or away from the fireball and covering exposed skin like the back of your neck with clothing, or, if this is unavailable, your hands, can help protect your eyes and vulnerable areas of exposed skin from severe flash burns. And while most fabrics will provide decent protection against the flash, lighter fabrics are preferred to dark, and natural fibers like cotton, wool, and linen definitely what you want over synthetics like nylon or polyester that may just melt to your skin. Indeed, one of the most iconic and disturbing images taken in the immediate wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shows the back of a young Japanese woman, the checkered pattern of her kimono burned into her skin by the bomb's thermal pulse. As previously alluded to, the main thermal pulse lasts only around 3 seconds and is followed by the blast wave, which can not only turn window glass and other debris into a swarm of deadly projectiles, but also collapse buildings and sweep away standing people like leaves, smashing them into walls and other obstacles with lethal force. force. It can also generate dangerous pressure fluctuations that can seriously damage the ears and lungs. In addition to protecting against flash burns, ducking and covering also provides significant defense against these mechanical hazards. To protect against falling debris and total building collapse, most duck and cover drills advise diving under tables, desks, doorways, and other reinforced structures. Such barriers also form cavities in the rubble in which you can survive until rescuers arrive to dig you out. Such tactics were based on practical experience gained during wartime air raids, such as the London Blitz of 1940 to 1941. During this period, the British Ministry of Home Security distributed thousands of Morrison table indoor shelters designed by engineer John Baker and named after Minister of Home Security Herbert Morrison. In a nutshell, the Morrison shelter was a bolt-together metal cage designed to protect citizens without cellars or more conventional Anderson bomb shelters from being crushed if the houses were bombed and collapsed while they were sleeping. Now, while the thermal pulse travels at the speed of light, 300 million meters or 980 million feet per second, the blast wave travels at a much slower 343 meters or 1,125 feet per second. Thus, depending on your distance from the hypocenter and the local speed of sound, it can take anywhere from a half a minute to as little as a second or two between first light and the blast wave arriving. This is why duck and cover drills advise to hit the deck as soon as you see the flash. While this might seem like an obvious and instinctive thing to do, history does not in fact bear out this assumption. For example, during the Halifax explosion of December 6, 1917, in which a burning munitions ship detonated with the explosive force of 2.9 kilotons of TNT, upon seeing the bright flash, hundreds of citizens rushed to their windows to see what was happening, only to be blinded or killed by flying glass when the blast wave arrived seconds later. Many similar incidents were reported during the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For example, 13-year-old Hiroshima student Mayuki Matsubara, who was less than 1 mile away from the hypocenter, immediately dropped to the ground upon seeing the flash. While she survived, the students standing around her remained upright and were swept away by the blast wave. Similarly, Professor Yoshiori Saiki of Nagasaki Medical School Hospital hit the dirt immediately upon seeing the bomb drop from the B-29 bomber boxcar. However, he did not remain prone for long enough after the flash subsided, and soon after, standing again, was struck by the blast wave and blown back several meters, sustaining minor injuries. Interestingly, in the 3 days between the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some residents of the former city were able to warn those of the latter about the curious effects of this terrible new weapon. As a result, some Nagasaki residents knew to immediately duck and cover upon seeing the flash. Now, though the Cold War ostensibly started as soon as World War II ended in September of 1945, mass implementation of civil defense measures in the United States did not begin in earnest until 5 years later. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union shocked the world by detonating its first atomic bomb, RDS-1, shattering the American nuclear monopoly years ahead of Western predictions. 3 years later, the Soviets introduced the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear strategic bomber, capable of delivering nuclear weapons to Canada and the continental United States by flying over the North Pole. And on June 25, 1950, North Korean troops stormed over the border into South Korea, triggering the Korean War and suddenly causing the nascent Cold War to go hot. For the first time in history, both North American civilians and military personnel faced the very real threat of an all-out nuclear war. As Alex Wellerstein, historian of science and nuclear weapons and professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology, explains, during this period, the United States is suddenly having to really reckon with the fact that it is not the only nuclear power out there anymore. Now, instead of just seeing the bomb as this asset that we could use or not use, it suddenly is brought to bear that this is something that could be used against us. Thus, in late 1950, Congress under President Harry Truman created the Federal Civil Defense Administration and launched a massive public education campaign called Alert America to help prepare the American people for this nightmare scenario. This campaign, including the film Duck and Cover, first screened on January 7, 1952 as a part of an Alert America exhibit convoy in Washington, D.C., and later debuted in American classrooms on March 6, 1952. At the same time, duck and cover drills were also included in materials aimed at adults and even military personnel. For example, the widely distributed civil defense pamphlet, Survival Under Atomic Attack, first published in 1951, instructed citizens to, number 1, try to get shielded if you have time. get down in a basement or subway. Should you unexpectedly be caught out of doors, seek shelter alongside a building or jump in any handy ditch or gutter. Number 2, drop flat on the ground or floor. To keep from being tossed about and to lessen the chances of being struck by falling and flying objects, flatten out at the base of a wall or at the bottom of a bank. Number 3, bury your face in your arms. When you drop flat, hide your eyes in the crook of your elbow. That will protect your face from flash burns, prevent temporary blindness, and keep flying objects out of your eyes. While even today, the U.S. Army's Field Manual 3.4, which covers protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical or NBC warfare, advises soldiers facing a nuclear blast that dropping immediately and covering exposed skin provides protection against blast and thermal effects. Immediately drop face down. A log, a large rod, or any depression in the Earth's surface provides some protection. Close eyes, protect exposed skin from heat by putting hands and arms under or near the body and keeping the helmet on. Remain face down until the blast wave passes and debris stops falling. Stay calm, check for injury, check weapons and equipment damage, and prepare to continue the mission. Nearly identical instructions were included in civil defense materials distributed in Canada, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and many other countries. The effectiveness of these and other survival techniques was actively tested using real nuclear weapons during a series of military maneuvers codenamed Exercise Desert Rock, carried out at the Nevada test site near Las Vegas between 1951 and 1957. The survivability of civilian infrastructure like houses, gas station cars, forests, and even different types of clothing and house paint were also evaluated using specially built survival towns or doom towns, with the most famous and well-documented of these tests taking place during the 29-kiloton Apple II shot of Operation Teapot on May 5, 1955. And noteworthy here, a much more recent, very similar phenomenon to a nuclear blast also demonstrated the usefulness of the duck and cover strategy. On February 15, 2013, an 18-meter-wide, 9,100-ton near-Earth asteroid entered the Earth's atmosphere and exploded at an altitude of around 30 kilometers over Chelyabinsk Oblast in the Russian Ural Mountains, unleashing the explosive energy of 500 kilotons of TNT. The shockwave from this shattered windows and damaged over 7,000 buildings in 6 cities and injured some 1,500 people, though thankfully no fatalities were reported. Pertinent to the topic at hand, in the city of Chelyabinsk, 4th grade teacher Julia Karbesheva saw the flash through a window and, assuming a nuclear weapon had detonated, ordered her class of 44 students to duck and cover. Not taking her own advice, however, she remained standing, receiving serious lacerations as the shockwave shattered the windows and showered her with glass. Not one of her students, however, suffered so much as a minor cut. Now, going back to the Cold War, while active civil defense measures like duck and cover drills, private and communal fallout shelters, air raid sirens, and evacuation plans for entire cities are among the most memorable elements of Cold War culture, government enthusiasm and funding for such endeavors waxed and waned constantly as cost-effective alternatives. For example, early on, military planners assumed that it would be far cheaper to simply prevent Soviet nuclear bombs from penetrating North American airspace using various systems, including anti-ballistic missile systems. However, the inherent limitations of all of these systems, combined with the Soviets continuously increasing their stockpile of nuclear missiles beyond what a feasible anti-ballistic missile system could reasonably defend against, eventually convinced the US government that implementing large-scale civil defense measures would save more citizens' lives for considerably less money. In addition to promoting prompt defensive measures like ducking and covering, the government also encouraged citizens to shelter in place in the immediate aftermath of a nuclear attack, either in basements or cellars or purpose-built home fallout shelters. This strategy not only shielded citizens from radioactive fallout until the most intense radiation decayed away, but also kept the streets clear of civilian vehicles, allowing emergency services to more easily reach those in need. However, studies soon revealed that such individual efforts would not be effective enough, so in July of 1961, the government, under President John F. Kennedy, launched a massive campaign to build and stock some 50 million large communal fallout shelters in public buildings all across the United States. However, Congress soon began to balk at the ballooning costs of this program, and funding for federal fallout shelters would continuously decline over the following decades. Nonetheless, conservative estimates predicted that even the existing network, along with shelter-in-place initiatives, would save an extra 27 million American lives in the event of nuclear attack. Unfortunately, a major technical development suddenly threw the government's carefully laid plans into chaos: the development of thermonuclear weapons, aka the hydrogen bomb. These weapons use nuclear fusion to greatly boost the yield of nuclear weapons, unleashing orders of magnitude more destructive power. Indeed, While the first nuclear weapon ever tested, the Trinity gadget, had a yield of 25 kilotons of TNT, the world's first thermonuclear weapon, the Ivy Mike device, detonated in the South Pacific on November 1st, 1952, had a yield of 10.4 megatons, over 400 times more powerful. Almost overnight, this extraordinary increase in destructive power turned nuclear weapons from merely conventional bombs, only bigger, into unthinkably destructive weapons. For example, according to the Canadian Civil Defense Guide, 11 Steps to Survival, a 5-megaton thermonuclear warhead will inflict total destruction out to a radius of 5 kilometers or 3 miles, and irreparable structural damage out to 8 kilometers or 5 miles. At the same time, the intense heat pulse will incinerate or inflict lethal third-degree burns on unprotected people out to 24 kilometers or 15 miles, inflict second-degree burns out to 30 kilometers or 18 miles, and touch-off fires out to 32 kilometers or 20 miles. About the only effect that would be milder than a low-yield fission weapon is the prompt neutron and gamma radiation, since the lethal radiation radius typically lies inside the fireball itself. So you would likely be incinerated and not need to worry about, well, anything ever again at this point, let alone radiation poisoning. Given a single thermonuclear weapon is thus capable of instantly obliterating all but the very largest of cities, by the 1960s, most urban centers had switched to a policy of evacuating their citizens into the countryside ahead of a nuclear attack. However, as ICBMs, by then the standard delivery method for nuclear weapons, give at most only 30 minutes warning of their arrival, the effectiveness of this strategy was dubious at best. Yet communal fallout shelters continued to be maintained and stocked until the end of the Cold War, especially in towns and cities near large military installations that were likely to be attacked first. Now at this point, as you might expect from thermonuclear nukes and ICBMs making most viable protection measures obsolete for city dwellers, as the Cold War dragged on and nuclear weapons became ever more powerful and accurate, the optimistic attitude of the 1950s began to fade, and most citizens became increasingly convinced that nuclear war would in fact bring about the end of civilization as we know it and should be avoided at all costs. As a result of this shift, in 1972, the government of President Richard Nixon disestablished the Office of Civil Defense and absorbed its functions into the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, whose function was more focused on natural disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, forest fires, and hurricanes. Later, under President Ronald Reagan, defense measures shifted back towards neutralizing enemy nuclear weapons via projects like Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars, and maintaining continuity of government by building a large network of command bunkers in which the people who actually matter in politicians and military leaders could shelter and continue directing the nation and its war while the plebeians die en masse on the outside as God intended, because those same politicians and military leaders could not figure out how to work out their differences with other politicians and military leaders, or otherwise realize that a thermonuclear war is a game where, as the Whopper so aptly put, the only winning move is not to play.